Everyone is obsessing over the headlines that hit the wires this morning. If you are looking at the ticker tape or the flickering green numbers of the stock market, you are already lost. You are looking at the shadow on the wall, not the hand holding the candle. Yesterday, the world thought the Strait of Hormuz was open for business. Trump tweeted in all capital letters, a digital victory lap that sent oil prices sliding. The markets breathed a sigh of relief, believing the crisis had passed. And then the trap snapped shut. This morning, Iran closed it again. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that control of the Strait has returned to its previous state of strict management. Armed forces are back in control, and the Persian Gulf has gone silent. Tankers are going dark, turning their transponders off as they approach the narrow neck of the world's energy supply. 5 Greek and Indian vessels made a U-turn before they even reached the mouth of the strait. One tanker stopped transmitting its location entirely, vanishing into the blue. The Iranian leadership used a specific word that I want you to hold on to. They did not call the American blockade a military action or a diplomatic maneuver. They called it piracy, and maritime robbery. Those are the exact words. I told you this was coming. I did not say it yesterday or last week. I have been saying this since before this war even started. And the structure of this situation makes the outcome completely predictable. And the reason it is predictable has nothing to do with Iran's raw military power. It has everything to do with the architecture that China built over the last 10 years. We are witnessing the result of a decade of quiet preparation. Today, I want to perform a surgical analysis of this reality. First, I will explain why Iran would never give up Hormuz on America's terms using game theory and structural history. Second, I want to tell you what happens next, because this morning is just the beginning. Let us start with the method of prediction. Predictive history is not about guessing or having an opinion. It is a clinical method. If you understand the incentives of the players, you can see the next move on the board. The method starts with a simple question. What does each player actually want? Not what they say they want in front of a microphone, but what they need for their survival. In game theory, those two things are almost always different. America says it wants the Strait of Hormuz open and a deal on the nuclear program. It says it wants the war to end. That is the public script. It sounds reasonable, even noble, to the average observer. But what does America actually want? Washington needs to demonstrate that it can still control the world's most important energy choke point. It needs to prove that it can force a regional power to submit to its will. The threat of American military force must remain the most powerful instrument in global politics. America needs to prove this to China, to Russia, and to every country watching this war. They are fighting to decide whether American power still means what it used to mean. Now, look at Iran. Tehran says it wants the blockade lifted and its frozen assets returned. It wants Lebanon included in a ceasefire and its sovereignty recognized. These are the talking points for the diplomats. But what does Iran actually want? Iran wants to establish permanently and irreversibly that the Strait of Hormuz is under Iranian sovereign control. Not just during this conflict, but forever. They want this to be a structural feature of the global system. Tehran wants every country that imports oil through those waters to know that Iranian permission is required. If that becomes the established reality, Iran transforms from a sanctioned pariah into an indispensable strategic actor. No amount of bombing can undo a transformation that is established in practice. These two goals are completely incompatible. America cannot demonstrate control while Iran is exercising sovereign authority. Iran cannot establish permanent authority while an American blockade declares its actions illegal. There is no middle ground here. One side wins this argument, or neither does. That is why I said months ago that Iran would never give up on America's terms. It is not because they are irrational or because they want a total war. it is because giving up would mean surrendering the one leverage point that makes them relevant. No state voluntarily gives up the thing that makes it matter on the global stage. This is simple game theory, yet Washington kept acting as though maximum pressure would force a fold. They thought bombing alone could change a strategic calculation rooted in survival. Iran did not fold, and this morning it proved it. But here is the part of the story that the mainstream media is failing to connect. How does a country that has been bombed for 50 days remain so confident? The supreme leader was killed on the first day of the conflict. 13 of their bases are partially or heavily paralyzed. The central bank warned internally that economic recovery could take 12 years. The pressure is more intensive than anything they have ever faced. And yet, this morning, they closed the Strait again without flinching. They called the world's only superpower a pirate. What is the structural foundation of that confidence? It can be summed up in one word: China. I do not mean China as a diplomatic ally that signs letters of support. I mean China as an economic architecture. China spent a decade building an infrastructure specifically designed for this moment. They wanted to ensure that if America tried to collapse Iran, the floor would not give way. I call this the decade of quiet. Once you understand it, you will never again be surprised by what happens in the Persian Gulf. It began in 2018 when the United States pulled out of the nuclear deal. At that moment, Beijing made a quiet decision. They decided to become Iran's economic lifeline. This was not about shared values or a civilizational bond. It was purely strategic. China imports approximately 1/3 of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Their entire industrial economy runs on energy that passes through a narrow 33-kilometer corridor. Historically, America has controlled that corridor. China calculated correctly that if America ever weaponized that control, Beijing would be in serious trouble. So they built a parallel system. They built it layer by layer away from the prying eyes of the West. The first layer is the payment architecture. China began buying Iranian oil in Chinese yuan instead of American dollars. This move bypassed the SWIFT financial network entirely. SWIFT is the global messaging system that enables dollar-denominated international payments. American sanctions work by cutting countries out of this system. If you cannot receive dollars, you cannot function in the modern economy. China's yuan payment system for Iranian oil bypasses all of that. Iran gets paid and the money never touches the dollar system. America cannot freeze what it cannot see or touch. The second layer is the dark fleet. This is a network of tankers that intelligence analysts call the shadow fleet. They spent 10 years perfecting the techniques of moving oil invisibly. These ships turn off their automatic identification system transponders. They go dark on satellite tracking. They fly the flags of random, sometimes landlocked countries to disguise their origin and ownership. They perform ship-to-ship transfers in international waters near Malaysia. Iranian crude is mixed with other oil and relabeled as Malaysian crude. It is then delivered to Chinese refineries known as teapots. Chinese customs records show zero imports from Iran since 2022, yet their recorded imports of Malaysian crude reached 1.3 million barrels per day last year. That is more than double Malaysia's entire oil production. The system worked perfectly. The third layer is strategic reserves. China entered this war sitting on approximately 1.22 billion barrels of crude oil. They built this massive storage over 2 years by purchasing discounted Iranian and Russian oil. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and oil prices spiked above $120, China did not panic. Their market stayed stable. Their refineries kept running while Europe was scrambling and warning of jet fuel shortages. China had 4 months of supply cover sitting in warehouses. The energy shock that America designed to force Iran to its knees never reached Beijing. They had prepared for the impact long before the first bomb fell. The fourth layer is one that most people are still ignoring: satellite intelligence. The T-01B satellite was built by a Chinese company and launched from Chinese soil. It was secretly acquired by the Iranian forces in late 2024. It has a resolution of 0.5 meters per pixel. That is 10 times sharper than Iran's own best equipment. It monitors Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia and the United States Fifth Fleet in Bahrain. It feeds targeting data in real time to Iranian strike systems. It creates a zone of 500 to 1,000 miles around Iran where anything that can be seen can be targeted. America cannot destroy those satellites without starting a direct war with China. This is the decade of quiet. It was a patient, invisible, and deliberate construction of power. China never announced it, and they never signed a formal treaty about it. They simply built it, rung by rung, this morning when Iran closed the Strait and called America a pirate. They did so from that foundation. Now I want to steelman the American position. I want you to test the logic of the other side. The American argument is that maximum pressure is working. They point to the numbers. The Iranian economy is in genuine trouble, and the rial has lost 15% of its value in a single month. Iran fired fewer missiles in the last week of the war than they did in the first. The blockade has turned back over 10 ships. America has expanded its boarding authority to cover the entire Arabian Sea. The Pentagon is rearming, sending more power into the region than they had at the start. They are applying pressure on every front: military, financial, and diplomatic. They believe the accumulated weight will eventually break Iran's resistance. This argument is not wrong about the pain. Iran is under genuine economic stress. The damage to their infrastructure is real. Trump even offered $20 billion in frozen assets to get them to talk. The negotiations on that number were real. Iran was discussing terms and movement was happening. The pressure argument has worked in the past in places like Libya in 2003. But here is what the American analytical framework misses. It confuses pain with collapse. Those are not the same thing. Pain means a country is suffering. Collapse means a country can no longer function. The distance between those two things is exactly what China's architecture was designed to create. The payment systems and the dark fleet did not prevent the pain. They prevented the collapse. Iran still has oil revenue flowing. It is not at pre-war levels, but it is enough to keep the lights on. They still have the structural support to make their own choices rather than being forced into them. Iran still has enough economic oxygen to decide when to open the Strait and when to walk away. Trump spent 50 days trying to force a decision. Instead, Iran is making its own. The difference is China. Let us look at what happens next. This morning is not a random event. It is a signal. There are three structural possibilities from this point forward. The first possibility is that the economic pressure finally crosses the threshold. Iran might accept a deal before the ceasefire expires on Tuesday. They might calculate that the cost of continuing is finally higher than the cost of conceding. In this scenario, the $20 billion in frozen assets becomes the decisive factor. Both sides would declare victory. Trump would say he won, and Iran would say it defended its sovereignty. But in the fine print, Iran would keep some form of coordinated access over the Strait. It would not be legal sovereignty, but it would be practical authority. Ships would have to coordinate with Iranian forces. Iran would call it managed navigation, and America would call it freedom of navigation. They would be telling two different versions of the same reality. This is the Libya path, but with a Chinese safety net. The second possibility is that the talks fail again. The ceasefire expires on Tuesday with no deal in sight. America would then face the decision it has been avoiding: escalate further or find a face-saving exit. Escalating means the bombing resumes, but the second round would be structurally different from the first. Iran's missile cities, buried deep in the mountains, have been clearing debris during this pause. Satellite images show heavy machinery operating around the clock at the Cayenne base. Half of Iran's missile launchers remain intact, buried but functional. China supplied the tunnel boring machines. Specifically for this purpose, Russia has supplied humanitarian aid that includes technologies for integrated air defense. Iran used the ceasefire to dig itself out and prepare for the next round. If the bombing resumes, America may find the second phase much more expensive. The third possibility is the one China is actively working toward. And this is an extended ceasefire that becomes a permanent reality without ever being called a formal deal. China has been in daily contact with both sides. Beijing coordinated with Russia to ensure their relationship remains unshakable. They delivered a 5-point peace initiative with Pakistan. China's interest is not in a decisive win for either side. China wants a stable Hormuz and a surviving Iran. They want to demonstrate to the world that American blockades cannot function without Chinese cooperation. And they want to be the ones who end the crisis with a phone call. If China can produce an indefinite ceasefire, it serves their interests perfectly. Iran survives, the oil flows, and the historical record shows that Beijing resolved the world's most important maritime crisis. They want the credit without the combat. Watch what China does not say in the next 72 hours. In this story, silence is the loudest signal. Their silence after major Iranian moves has been a consistent feature of this conflict. Let me bring this all together. I said Iran would never give up on America's terms because the game theory made it the only logical conclusion. You do not give up the one thing that makes you relevant. Iran's ability to refuse was not just stubbornness. It was the result of the decade of quiet. China built the payment systems, the shadow fleet, the strategic reserves, and the satellite networks. They shipped the tunnel boring machines and the weapons while Washington was focused on headlines. This morning, Iran proved that American strength, however overwhelming, could not translate into the specific outcome Washington wanted. The ceasefire expires in 3 days. The second round of talks has no confirmed date. The Iranian parliament says the rules of the Strait will be determined on the battlefield. Trump says they have agreed to everything, but Tehran says those claims are false. Ships are turning around in the Persian Gulf, and the world is waiting. In Beijing, nobody is surprised by any of this. That is what happens when one side plays the long game and the other side plays for social media engagement. This is not a prophecy, it is structural history. The decade of quiet produced exactly what it was designed to produce. The next phase will be determined by whether America treats this as a 3-player game. You cannot solve a puzzle when you pretend one of the players is not at the table. The reality is much deeper than the headlines suggest. Read the statements from the Iranian Guard this morning. Look at the reports of ships turning around. Follow the money in the $20 billion negotiations. Then ask yourself a question. And if China spent 10 years making sure Iran never had to give up, what else have they already built? What other crises are they prepared for that we have not even seen coming? The decade of quiet did not end with this war. It is still running, and it is happening right now. Whatever they are building today will determine the next moment exactly like this one. The board is set, and the game is much older than you think.